Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to add binding to your quilt on your sewing machine. There are several ways you can do this, but I'm going to show you my preferred way and the way I think you get the neatest results. I'm going to be showing you on samples, on not a whole quilt, but just on small samples I've made, and I'm going to be using purple thread so you can see my stitching. Obviously, when you do this, you'll use matching thread. I'll also show you at the end of the video how it looks when you use matching thread, so you get an idea of how it will look.
First, fold your binding tape in half down the centre. This I've cut 2.5 inches wide. Just fold it, no need to press it. And then clip or pin down one side of your quilt, starting in the centre and leaving a good tail end for joining. When you've pinned all down one side, you need to make a mark where the bottom of the quilt is, and then measure 1/4 inch from that mark and put another mark, and this is where you're going to sew to. Now at your sewing machine, sew from about halfway down the side, remembering you've left that long tail end, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. For this, if you have one, you'll need to put on your walking foot. If you don't worry, you can manage without it. It makes life a lot easier though. So sew down, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance to the mark that we made. When you get to the mark, you're going to stop with your needle down, back tack a few stitches, and then you can remove your quilt from the sewing machine. Then at your cutting mat, using the lines on your cutting mat to guide you, place your quilt level with one of the lines and make your 45-degree angle fold on your binding, as you can see I've done there, and then make sure that the rest of the binding is following the same line as your quilt on the cutting mat. Hold your fingers on the 45-degree angle fold and then pull the rest of the binding tape back over and make sure it's nice and level at the top and the side, and then you can pin it in place or clip if you prefer. Before taking over to the sewing machine, mark the next 1/4 inch from the bottom. So again, mark where the bottom of the quilt is and then put a mark 1/4 inch up from that, and this is the mark that you will be sewing to. Now at your sewing machine, taking again your 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting right at the top in the top right hand corner, so 1/4 inch seam all the way down to your mark that you made 1/4 inch from the bottom, back tacking when you get to the mark. Then at your cutting mat, repeat the process of folding over the corner. Remember to keep it nice and straight and fold at a 45-degree angle. Fold the tape back over, keeping it nice and square at the top. Clip in place, and then we're ready to sew our next seam. Continue with this process until you have sewn the binding round all 4 sides of your quilt, but remember to leave a large opening ready to join the 2 ends of your binding. To join your 2 pieces of binding, mark the centre of your side of your quilt, or roughly the centre, and then cut one piece off at this mark. So draw a line and then cut. Then fold the other side of the binding over the top and mark the centre on the other side of the binding and put a mark, and then you're going to measure 2.5 inches from this mark, and this is where you're going to cut. To join the binding, take the left hand piece and place it right side facing up, then the right side piece and face that right side down at right angles, and then pin in place to secure it before you mark your sewing line. Our sewing line is at a 45-degree angle, so if like me you have a quilter's ruler with a 45-degree angle on, then you can line that 45-degree angle with the top of your binding, and then draw from your top left hand corner down to the bottom corner of the binding that is underneath. I hope that makes sense. But if you start in the top left hand corner of your top piece of binding and you draw a 45-degree angle, then it will take you to the right place. My first line I didn't get quite right, so I'm just doing it again. I was a little bit too far up. Alternatively, if you don't have a 45-degree angle, then you can just draw from the top left hand corner of your top piece down to the bottom right hand corner of your bottom piece. Then sew directly on the line you have just drawn, remembering to back tack at the start and the finish. Then trim to about 1/4 inch from the seam. Then open out the seam and finger press. If you prefer, you could press at your iron. And then all that needs to be done here is now to pin or clip it to your quilt. Then at your sewing machine, sew, closing the gap, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. You will notice that all through this I'm using a purple thread. This is so that you can see where I'm sewing. I just thought it would be easier to do it this way so you can see. But obviously when you're doing this, you'll use matching thread. So in this case, you'd use pink. Now we can fold our binding over and make those mitered corners. So gently turn your binding over to the right side, and those corners on this side should naturally appear on the right side of the fabric. Fold the binding over to the backing side of the quilt, going about 1/8 inch past the original sewing line where you attach the binding to the quilt. When you get to the corner, turn over and check on the front side to see which side has the bulk of the fabric, and make sure on the backing that the bulk of the fabric is on the opposite side. So fold the binding over on the side all the way up to the top, and then just fold the top edge down, and this one fell into place really nicely. Continue to clip or pin all the way around until you get to the next corner, and we'll just go through the next corner and see if that's as smooth. Again, I check which side the bulk of the fabric is on, and this time I'm going from the side and pushing the binding all the way up to the top. This one's a little bit more tricky, as you can see. Push the binding all the way up to the top and then fold the other side over, and it should form a nice mitered corner. Clip or pin in place, and then carry on clipping or pinning your binding all the way around until you get back to where you started from. Then at your sewing machine, on the right side of your quilt and just to the left of your binding, you're going to stitch. Back tack at the start and sew as close to that binding tape as you can get without actually sewing on it. And because we pinned or clipped the binding to go 1/8 inch over the original sewing line on the back, that means that we should be catching the back of the binding in. I'm using purple thread here so that you can see the stitching, but obviously when you do it you would use probably a cream on here, so cream for the top of the quilt, and on your bobbin you would have a pink because you're sewing on the binding at the back. But in this case I'm doing it all in purple so that you can see. When you get to the corner, make sure you don't go over the binding but get as close to the binding as you can, and then turn and carry on down the other side. You're not sewing over the mitered corners on the front of your quilt, but you will be on the reverse of the quilt, so don't worry, they will be held secure. Carry on around the rest of the quilt till you get back to where you started, and then back tack. Sometimes when you're sewing you miss a little bit and you don't catch it in on the back. If this happens to you, you just need to unpick it until you get to a point on both sides where you have caught the binding in, and then you take it back over to your sewing machine and sew again, making sure this time that when you clip it down you definitely go past your original seam by your 1/8 inch, and then re-sew. And this is how it turned out. As you can see the purple stitching, but had I used cream colour they'd be barely noticeable. And this is the underside of the quilt. Obviously you can see because I've used purple stitching, but had I used a matching pink you wouldn't notice. And here's one that I made using the contrasting thread. So here I've used a pale pink thread and you can barely see it. I have to fold it back for you to see it. And here's the other side, here's the reverse side. You can just see the pink stitching there, but that's the top side, that's the side you would see on the quilt.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, could you please like and subscribe? Thank you, and I'll see you next time.